This is Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid, and I'm here with my co-host, Matthew Yglesias.
Hello.
Hey, Matt. So what's up this week?
Talking about takes. Got a bad one here. This one, I feel bad because this bad take is from Rich Lowry. He is the editor of National Review, and I've disagreed with Rich about a lot of stuff over the years, at times harshly. But we were on a panel together recently, a couple months ago, and we were kind of vibing and sort of agreed that like maybe I'd been too mean to him in the past.
Oh.
But
about what? Oh, well, okay. I'll let you. Okay, But I kind of want to know what. But okay, I'll focus on
I
the
thought this
take.
take was terrible. Okay. So he is talking about asylum seekers, and red state governors have been moving them to different places. There was this particularly attention-grabbing one where Ron DeSantis sent some people to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. And Rich, he quote tweets something about, this story, and he says, apparently no one outraged by what DeSantis did stopped to consider that being flown to Martha's Vineyard was probably the best thing that's happened to these migrants after a hellish months-long trek. And part of what makes this an annoying take is that, Rich is a smart guy. So he has calibrated this to be something that is, literally true.
Yes.
Right? That if you are because these guys are from Venezuela. So the economic situation in Venezuela, quite bad. People fled from Venezuela, typically to neighboring countries in South America. But then those countries' economies got really hammered by COVID because South America has so much dependence on natural resource extraction. And so a lot of people started leaving, Colombia or adjacent areas. Then to make it to America from South America, you have to cross this area that's called the Darien Gap in Panama, which, just Google it, read something else. But it's apparently really harrowing making it across this zone in Panama. Then you're in Mexico where the transportation infrastructure gets better. But there's a lot of crime problems in Mexico.
It's very
Again,
dangerous.
Google it if you haven't heard. Very bad. Then you make it to the U.S. border. Some people to El Paso. There's a bunch of different border crossings. But all of those towns are a little bit overwhelmed with the number of people who've come seeking asylum. And so people are in quite bleak conditions, at times sleeping on the streets, et cetera. And it is 100% true that upon arrival in Martha's Vineyard, a liberal town that, DeSantis was trying to stick it to them by sending immigrants up there. They were trying to stick it back to DeSantis by being nice and helping these people out. And so it is true in a literal sense that if you look at the population of Venezuelan asylum seekers who were in Texas, the subsample of them who Ron DeSantis flew to Martha's Vineyard are probably better off than the ones who did not get flown to Martha's Vineyard. That being said, to describe this as an act of generosity on Ron DeSantis's part, or to suggest that liberals have somehow neglected that, is that's crazy. That's stupid.
This is not good faith.
Well,
that's my tamed average. Yeah, it's a yes. What is so frustrating is that this is a technically true tweet, but a seriously bad take because he's taking the situation and look, this is bad take. This is classic, right? It's a classic thing because it's true. I mean, you're talking about a harrowing journey to get to the United States, and that it would be far nicer to be on a plane going to Martha's Vineyard than trying to navigate the criminal elements of border towns in Mexico and trying to get yourself across the border. I mean, yes, but it's ridiculous.
Just to break down what has been going on here, right? Ron DeSantis is smarter than these other guys, so he came up with a better gimmick.
Yeah.
But Greg Abbott started this, and he's been sending people by bus to New York and to Washington, D.C. And the goal of that, which he has succeeded in, is creating a situation in which Eric Adams and Muriel Bowser, who are the mayors of those cities respectively, have started saying to the federal government, oh, hey, our social service infrastructure is being kind of taxed by this quantity of people who are showing up and who need help. We need you, Joe Biden, to do something to help us out. And I think, this is a stunt on Greg Abbott's part, but it's not a crazy stunt. It is factually true that the number of asylum-seeking arrivals in New York City and Washington, D.C. has put strain on the social services system and that those cities could use more help with it. And the quote-unquote larger point that Abbott is trying to illustrate here, that the social service systems in El Paso and San Antonio and McAllen are also overwhelmed for the same reason and could also use help, like that's true.
Yeah, I mean, the problem here is, though, these are human beings that he's putting on a bus and shuttling them around as if it's
But then DeSantis, to up the ante,
sure,
was like, okay, I'm going to send people not to some large progressive cities that happen to be far away from the border, but where, the basic logistics of like finding emergency shelter for somebody in Washington, D.C., or finding a Spanish-speaking interpreter in Washington, D.C., those are like pretty simple. Right? If the number of people gets too high, we get overwhelmed. But like we can do that. We can provide social services to people. DeSantis flew 50 people to a offshore island vacation community that does not have infrastructure to do anything like this. And then he deliberately didn't tell anyone that they were coming. Right, because he was going out of his way to try to create a disaster. There wasn't a disaster. They rallied the local
community.
The AP Spanish class from the high school went over to be interpreters because they don't have interpreters.
Oh, wow, that's a detail I didn't see.
Church
that's wild.
came together and provided emergency shelter because they don't have an emergency shelter. But ultimately, they went on a boat to the mainland, to a National Guard base that has extra space. And then when that happened, the New York Post, which is a conservative newspaper, ran a headline saying that liberals had deported these immigrants from Martha's Vineyard.
Right.
Which, again, it's not a place where you would handle an influx of refugees, right? Like if a boat full of people washed up somewhere in Massachusetts and they needed help, you would send them to either this National Guard base on Cape Cod or you would send them into Boston because those are places that have facilities for people. And, DeSantis is just, I don't know what to say about it. Like he's trying to start shit and he's good at it.
You know what? One criticism we've received. We should say DeSantis, he's the Republican governor of Florida.
Oh, yes.
And he's
Greg Abbott, who I referred to before, is the governor of Texas.
Yes. And these two Republican governors are, they're being eyed for 2024, kind of,
Well, DeSantis is.
Yeah. I don't know. Abbott, no. But in any case, we're looking at two, probably not. But anyway, we're looking at two kind of big players in the Republican Party.
Yeah. I've become like a Greg Abbott guy, speaking of primaries. Not because I like Greg Abbott, but just because, like, he's doing the work. Like, the reason Greg Abbott is doing stuff to deal with Venezuelan asylum seekers is that they are showing up in his home state of Texas.
So I think
DeSantis literally had to send the plane to San Antonio
to get people.
To get the people, just so that he could make himself the senator. And this is where I really do think it's like a bad Lowry take. Like, there is a genuine policy issue here that people can have a range of views on, and that Abbott and Biden and other people, there's elements of politicking going on in what everyone is doing. But Doug Ducey, who's the governor of Arizona, Greg Abbott's the governor of Texas, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. We're managing the relationship with Venezuela. Like, all these people are, at least on some level, trying to deal with a real issue. And DeSantis is like literally inserting the government of Florida into something that has nothing to do with them because he wants attention, because he's trying to run for president. And to construe that as a benefit, millions of dollars were spent on this enterprise. Like, he could have just given them that money.
Yeah, it was something like $12,000 per person who was flown there. And I thought, $12,000, that they could set up an apartment, they could set up life.
San Antonio is a low cost of living city.
Imagine if you had $12,000 suddenly, you could definitely set yourself up okay.
You get a little.
Well, I don't mean to be flip about it. I just mean that it was a lot of money per person.
Right. To construe it as a benefit.
It was, yes, and it was. And now there are these questions about criminal questions. Were these people lied to put them on a plane? And like that's, I don't know how great it is to be lured onto a plane and then find out you're going somewhere that you didn't know you were going. I think that's, that maybe wouldn't be the best part of a trip for me per se. But the point being, this is a political stunt in the extreme, really. And so the question is, why would you do that if you're Ron DeSantis? And, we're heading into a midterm election. The polls have been up and down, I would say. I don't know where we are today. I read something.
Good issue for Republicans.
Yeah. What's turning out to be a bad issue for Republicans. Abortion is not a good thing for them to talk about right now. Gas prices are back down.
Well,
it's not a great moment.
Part of the cleverness of DeSantis, right, is Greg Abbott has signed a very extreme abortion ban in Texas. DeSantis has not done that in Florida. And so he is trying to both be the Republican Party presidential nominee while also ducking this thing that's a huge issue for conservative activists, but is also very unpopular nationally. And so this is it's a true political genius on his part, right? That the story, you imagine a Democrat, right, running for president, a front runner who is doing nothing to stand up for choice.
Right.
It's inconceivable. The pressure reducing. And DeSantis.
You made me pause and think about that of what is going on in Florida. I would have thought there's got to be something afoot.
There's a move in the legislature to enact, I think, a 15-week ban, which is not nothing, but is a much more popular.
And we're not talking Texas. It's not the same. It's a good point.
Clinics in Miami and Orlando and Jacksonville would stay open under this bill, whereas they've all closed in Texas. And DeSantis is simultaneously making himself the face of this migration backlash while also not getting yelled at by his base for not taking more dramatic but politically dicier action on abortion. And he's a smart guy, for all his weird anti-intellectual posturing. He's super smart guy, went to top schools, knows what he's doing.
So we've talked about this over the years, right? Of Trump as a person versus Trump as a politician versus Trump as his positions. Is Ron DeSantis, I'm going back to thinking through that moment where, as I recall, Trump, really dropped in the public opinion polling around the stories that were coming out about kids being put in cages at the border and families being separated. And that policy was widely, I shouldn't say widely or universally, but certainly enough of the public said, wow, that's really bad. They, disapproved. So I was surprised in a way by this, that DeSantis thought it was a good idea to do something so extreme with immigrants.
But this is why, this is what makes the asylum situation so challenging for presidents is that all of the options are pretty bad, right? When Obama was president and unaccompanied minors first started coming, it was a huge, quote unquote crisis for his administration, right? He looked really bad because there were these kids and they were in these really dingy, bad conditions. Right. And so he was taking heat for that.
Right.
So then he acted to try to improve conditions and make things more humane. But then people kept coming. And so then he was getting hit for saying, well, look, when you treat people so generously, you're creating this magnet. Yeah. Then Trump became president. And, initially I think he had thought, well, this tough guy is going to be in charge, so they'll stop coming. And there was an initial sort of Trump pause. But then people kept coming. They were coming back. And he was very frustrated with it. And there's all these accounts from John Kelly of Trump being can't we just shoot them?
Sure.
Horrifying stuff. And eventually what they hit on was, well, we can prosecute everyone for illegal entry as a felony, which means you go into the criminal justice system, which means you're separated from your kids. And that will deter people from coming. But when Americans saw that, they were horrified.
Yeah.
And there was this big backlash against Trump. And so you get in this back and forth where it's if people are mistreated, the voters don't like that. But if large numbers of people come, the voters also don't like that, right? There's no political consensus either in favor of we should just welcome tons and tons and tons of asylum seekers from all over Latin America, nor is there political appetite for, we should shoot people without due process, we should separate them from their children.
I think that there's a third thing going on, or a third option, which is that there's an objection. I think the story around people coming is sort of imagery of people huddled at the border. And I think if you had a more orderly system, you wouldn't have those images. And I think that the fear factor among the public might not be there. I'm not saying that is the policy to choose or that I would support. I'm just saying that the two things are not just diametrically opposed,
absolutely.
but that it's this imagery being played up of, remember the caravan, oh, look at all these people are coming, and this sort of imagery of, oh my goodness, there are these masses at the border. And so it's not, I don't know. Yeah.
But this is why I think Lowry framing it as an act of generosity is like propagandistic and a little bit beneath Rich's intelligence and acumen, because it's like DeSantis is finding a way, not a solution to this problem, but a way to exploit the problem, which is he can do something that's like, here, I'm going to help you out with this ride to Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah.
But
and
then it's just like,
look, it's also just, it does have it is a perfect own the libs. And then it also gives a talking point, like, to sort of, if you're a DeSantis reporter, it's sort of like, oh, he's not hurting anybody. To my question of the cages, it's like, well, he's not hurting people.
Right, because what they don't want to say, and you keep seeing this, right? Like Abbott, DeSantis, all the Republicans are like, Biden border crisis, like he's got to do something, But they don't say what they want Biden to do.
Sure.
Because if they were to say, well, we need to go back to child separation, we need to shoot people at the border, like that sounds horrifying.
Yes.
And so the whole game is like, take this kind of thorny logistical problem that creates ugly visuals and like dump it on somebody else's lap so that you can point at them.
And usually in politics, it's more of a metaphor, but DeSantis went real literal here.
Well, and especially because, these people are coming from Venezuela, right?
Yeah.
So one thing that would reduce the flow of asylum seekers from Venezuela.
You know what I think? I think this is a good moment to pause. I think we should take a break, and then we should come back and talk about
serious discussion of economic development in Venezuela.
I think maybe. I mean, we should talk about the roots of the problem. I think that's where we're headed, right? Should we take a break?
Maybe.
All right, let's take a break.
Okay, so I don't actually want to say that this is the whole root of the problem, because the root of the problem is that Nicolas Maduro is bad at running the government and has made Venezuela in a poor situation. That being said,
I'm nodding, but also shaking my head. Okay, continue.
That being said,
yes.
A thing that Joe Biden could do that would unquestionably reduce the flow of asylum seekers from Venezuela is to lift sanctions on Venezuela. The sanctions are not, quote unquote, the cause of Venezuela's economic problems, but they don't help. That's the whole point of the sanctions, is to make the economy in Venezuela worse. And if Biden were to lift those sanctions, it's not just that Republicans would object, but Florida Republicans, like Ron DeSantis, are leading the charge, right?
Yes.
And so their whole thing in American foreign policy is that we need to try to make specifically Cuba and Venezuela, and they would also argue Nicaragua, as poor as possible because of their bad leftist governments. And the old Florida Republican political consensus was that we should have all these sanctions on Cuba, but we should also have very generous treatment of refugees from Cuba.
Right.
Right? And there was always something a little bit unprincipled about that.
Well,
but it reflected a coherent viewpoint.
Yes.
Yes,
it was it was, I don't think it's that much in conflict. It's sort of saying either we are going to punish you into submission until you change your ways. And look, if you want to defect and come here and live as an American, that's fine.
And traditionally, it's no coincidence that Marco Rubio and the Diaz-Balart family in the House were the leading congressional Republican proponents of immigration reform. They were Cuban Americans, and their community was not specifically impacted by this, but they had succeeded in creating this policy dynamic in which we were trying to create economic hardship in Cuba and then trying to welcome emigres from Cuba. And they had learned that Cuban emigre community in South Florida had built, it's a very unique and I think successful North American cultural and economic hub in South Florida. It's a political machine, but like Miami's great, and my
should we also
my family's from Tampa is actually part of a separate wave of Cuban migration, but I'm connected to this. But so then Rubio was like, oh, like we should be maybe a little nicer to these Mexican American undocumented people. But he's flipped on that, right? Like all the Florida Republicans have completely flipped on immigration to the point where, like, now they're mad that people are coming from Venezuela, even while they insist that we should be trying to impoverish Venezuela as a policy measure. And, you can do that, but it's to me, it's a little sick to say that, like, we're going to maintain stringent economic sanctions on a foreign country, and then when people flee the country because their economy is collapsing, we're going to be like, oh no, buddy.
Right. Well, what is that? I think Marco Rubio came out in roughly, it would have been 2012, right? That he was part of those early
2013.
2013. Yeah. This 2013 was in response to the 2012 election, where there was this Republican postmortem done on why did the Republican Party lose the election. And there was this brief moment where the Republican Party thought, we need to broaden our tent. We need to figure out a way to get in different types of voters. And it seemed like softening on immigration would be a useful route. And very rapidly, Rubio didn't even vote for his own bill in the end because it became very clear that that was not going to be a popular position.
Their base was going in a different direction.
Yes, and obviously that was confirmed in 2016 that, the base had gone in very much the opposite direction, that, after Mitt Romney lost, the answer wasn't to moderate the party, but to go further right. So, as far as policy-wise, is this smart? It doesn't add up to say we're going to, put economic sanctions on you and then not let you come here if you're driven out of your country. It's a political problem for them.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's worth saying about that autopsy report, right, because people sometimes say, a story that you often hear is Republicans after 2012 decided that to win, they needed to moderate on immigration, but then they didn't moderate on immigration, and, like, they won anyway. So now they've kind of forgotten about it. But I think it's important to understand that, like, in 2012, 2013, when that was written, Republicans were trying really, really hard to privatize Medicare. That was, like, at the center of Paul Ryan's politics,
right,
et cetera. And the, like, meta-political point of that whole report was to, like, not have an explicit discussion of maybe we should ease off on this Medicare thing.
Well, I'm not saying it was right or wrong. I'm just saying that Marco Rubio in that moment seemed to think it was a good strategy to take that position. He put himself out on a limb and then very quickly realized that's a bad place to be, and he came back from the limb. But it is useful to say that I'm not saying the postmortem itself was perhaps a thorough and actual look at what was going on inside the Republican Party. It was just this brief moment in time.
Okay, but so here's what I want to say. Trump eventually had a resolution to this asylum seeker dilemma that worked. And what it was that he got Mexico to interdict people so that they didn't make it to the border. And I mean, I talked about this on my old podcast with Dara Lind many times because she specializes in this area. But when U.S. Border Patrol officers were doing cruel things to asylum seekers, there was incredible backlash in the United States. When asylum seekers were showing up and being treated well, there was huge backlash to that in the United States. When Mexican immigration officials were, who even knows how they were stopping people from coming. But the point is there were no stories about it, right? Like CNN never had its talking heads all on to do a panel to talk about, like, some shit that went down in Chiapas, right? And that really worked well. Like, Trump got the Mexican government to do his dirty work for them.
Let's define worked well, because I think
it
worked.
It solved the problem. It solved the political problem.
Yes,
right?
The political problem. Like, just to highlight that,
Yes.
if any listeners at home confused about whether you think it's a good idea to
the dilemma: how do you deter people from coming without sparking backlash over cruelty? And the answer is you outsource it to somebody else.
Right.
And Trump got this idea from Angela Merkel and European officials who made this deal with Turkey several years earlier, where it was, the way they structured it was that, like, they're going to give aid to Turkey to help Turkey assist with an influx of migrants.
Right.
And then, like, not ask too many questions about, like, what does Turkey
what's
actually
going on,
do with the money.
and what's going on in these, in these refugee camps and such. But then the refugee camp is not in Germany.
Exactly. So when Biden took over, I really thought that he was going to make some cosmetic changes to Trump's policy and essentially continue with that externalization, because his campaign put out all this stuff about how they were going to tackle the root causes of migration in, like, a collaborative regional context.
Yeah.
And then also Susan Rice was put in charge of Domestic Policy Council, which has jurisdiction over immigration policy. And Susan Rice, for those who don't recall, she was National Security Advisor under Obama. Before that, she was an assistant secretary in the Clinton administration and also an NSC staffer.
It was a little bit surprising to me that she became domestic policy advisor because of her areas of specialty.
She's a career national security person.
But it signaled that a serious commitment to connecting domestic immigration policy to the actual, to foreign policy.
Right. But I thought that they meant this in, like, a cynical way that was like, we're going to keep doing what Trump was doing, but we're going to, like, pretend it's different. But I don't quite even know how to characterize what's actually happened. Like, Mexican cooperation with the externalization of enforcement seems to have fallen off. It's a harrowing journey to the U.S.-Mexico border, but people are making it through, evidently. Right. I mean, they're facing a lot of problems, but, like, they are there in Texas. And Biden keeps having sporadic meetings with the president of Mexico in which, like, they agree that, like, Mexico is going to tackle migration. Right. Like, Biden, the like domestic politics of this are, like, Republicans are all mad at Biden for not stopping these migrants from coming. But Biden is not, like, giving speeches where he's like, Republicans are wrong. It's good for many people to arrive and seek asylum in the United States, right? Like, he did this Los Angeles declaration on migration at the Summit of the Americas where it was like, people shouldn't come. Kamala Harris went to Guatemala. She did this speech. She's like, do not come. They're putting out press releases with AMLO saying he's going to stop people from coming. So there's been some kind of breakdown of the policy here between Washington, Mexico City, in South America. But nobody is being quite, because Republicans are so eager to blame Biden, and because Biden is trying to fudge the difference between sort of, like, bleeding heart liberals who want to help and moderates who, like, actually don't want asylum seekers to come. Nobody's being super clear as to, like, what the actual issue is. And there was this very puzzling New York Times article about Ken Salazar, who you probably remember Ken Salazar.
I do, yeah.
He used to be a senator.
Yes, yeah.
He used to be Interior Secretary.
What's he up to now?
Well, that's the thing. He's ambassador to Mexico.
Is he?
And the Times ran this.
That's really bad that I'm sort of puzzled by this. And I don't want to. So we've gotten some feedback that the show does a lot of interrupting. So I'm trying to let you finish your thought, but I also want to go back to the Biden. Well, okay.
Well, here, I just want to say.
Wrap it up.
The Times had this story about Salazar where it was like, oh, we interviewed dozens of U.S. officials, and, like, they say Salazar has, like, gone rogue and he sides too much with the president of Mexico and he's undermining American policy. And I read that story and I was like, whoa.
I missed this.
And
that's wild that I'm like, I don't know that one.
No,
that's not good.
This is the thing. It happened in June or July. And then I was waiting. I was like, where's the I count on, like, Axios and Politico to, like, deliver some like dishy follow-up on a story like that. But nobody had anything. And the New York Times' Mexico bureau has just moved on to write, like, very earnest stories about things that are happening in Mexico. I mean, important stories. So then, like, I try to ask some of my friends in Congress. I'm like, what's up? What's up with the AMLO? And they're like, I don't know.
All right. So I am copping to it. I missed the Salazar story. I don't find the Biden policy that confusing. There has been an increase in the number of people coming to the border. We know that. But as I understand it, this summer, the Biden administration has been saying that immigrants coming through at the border seeking asylum are going to be pushed into the immigration court system, and they'll get a date, and then that they'll have to show up in court for their date. And it's sort of a return to past policies. But it seems like a move towards orderly processing rather than intimidation by Mexico as a policy, or at least a blended policy that,
right. But,
you're trying to move people through. And so I think that on a political broad stroke level, you don't want these two things. You don't want to look like you're a monster, and you also don't want a surge of people coming to the border and causing, this sort of, these images of just huge numbers of people waiting around at the border. So, it seems like just a reality that you have to deal with, that there are people at the border and that you have to make a decision of what to do with them. And it seems like the Biden administration is saying we're going to try to increase the processing speed and I think open up that process more so than it was under the Trump administration. And then meanwhile, I do think that the question of what's happening between the U.S. and Venezuela is an open question, because there were talks this summer also of whether or not Biden was going to go to Venezuela and do some talking, especially amid the oil crisis.
To get the oil.
But he ended up not doing that.
So I just want to say, I think one reason that you're not as confused as I am about Biden's immigration policies is that I would say he's been fairly successful at kind of like tricking liberals into thinking that he's being more welcoming of immigrants than he really has. But like, here's a political story from the Biden AMLO summit that Sabrina Rodriguez did back in July, and she's going here at the end, on a policy level, the relationship between the two countries has gotten more complicated under Biden. Trump's priority was always clear: for Mexico to stop migrants before they got to the border. Under Biden, however, the two countries have discussed a more nuanced set of policy objectives, with Biden asking for help stopping migrants while also stressing the need for humanitarian protections, ways to tackle the pressures that force people to migrate. But then she keeps going on. Like, the Biden administration is asking AMLO to stop people from coming, right? Like, the policy he wants is for Mexico to stop almost everyone from arriving.
Right.
And then to treat a trickle of people who do arrive in like a decent way.
Right.
Whereas Trump wants the opposite, right? He wants Mexico to stop almost everyone, and then the handful of people who do get arrived, he'll treat cruelly.
Right.
But there's this consensus, really, that Mexico should be stopping the flow of people. But I mean, I don't know 100% what to say about it, other than that, like, the Mexican government has problems of its own to deal with.
I don't think
and I think it's understandable.
I actually take issue with the fact that, like, I'm some type of liberal that is so enchanted by the Biden administration that I'm somehow like tricked into believing that he's good. I never think anything is good. But two, I mean, it's just true that at the border, it seems like the goal is to process people through the immigration courts. And there was a huge backlog in the courts. And so you've got that problem structurally of how do you get people through. And it seems like the answer is going to be you're going to have to move more people into the interior of the country and have them, just wait out their dates, which is, that's what's going on. I don't know what else to tell you about that. And like, yes, you're right. That is different than separating children from their parents and putting them in cages. But like, I don't.
No, but what I'm saying is that the real policy of both administrations is to try to get Mexico to stop people from coming.
Okay. So they want this barrier.
Trump was succeeding, like on a diplomatic level at that. And Biden is failing. And I think that that's the actual issue here, because you're saying, like, it's true, like, yes, like Biden wants to increase the processing, there's this thing about the court dates, et cetera, but there's with any policy question, right, there's the ends and there's the means.
Yeah.
A policy goal that a person could have is for the United States to welcome a large number of asylum seekers from South America and Central America. But Biden doesn't have that goal. He's not trying to facilitate people's entry to the
he point blank. I mean, he ran for office saying you have to shift what's happening in home countries so that people don't want to come to the United States, that this upheaval and economic problems in these countries need to be changed. I think our point of disagreement is just that I do think that there's a big difference here between what happens once you trickle through Mexico. Mm-hmm. And I also just don't know that once you get up to the gate and you're in the system, that's different than it used to be.
All right.
And whether or not Biden is succeeding here on the merits or on, rhetorically, it's not a winning issue for anybody.
Well,
in
it's
the
a winning issue.
Well, it's a winning issue for DeSantis. It's just not a winner. Even though the Democratic Party there are advocates inside the party who have fought for immigration reform and are certainly an important constituency, it's not a big motivating voting factor for Democrats. And meanwhile, Democrats have to win over the center, and sort of being out there strident on immigration is not useful for them in winning an election.
So let's wrap this up.
Yeah.
Rich Lowry, bad take.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Acting like DeSantis is doing a favor to the people he's
not doing anything.
Tricking onto airplanes at San Antonio. No, he is playing a shrewd form of political hardball. I think we agree on this. I'm not sure if we do or not.
No, I think we agree.
But what makes it shrewd,
the
reason this is shrewd hardball is that it is genuinely true that Biden does not have good answers on policy.
No, so this is why it's a good issue.
Anything that elevates it is just per se embarrassing.
There are two things that are good about this, which is that one, DeSantis knows that the Republican base feels strongly about immigration, so it's a good issue just on the merits of the issue for him. And then, you're saying that too, Biden, and really, you look back to the Obama administration, they've had the same problem of how do you answer these questions, and it's not easy, and they don't have clear answers. So I agree with you on those things, and I agree with you that this Rich Lowry take is both technically true and a bad take.
All right. Well, there we go. So this has been another episode of Bad Takes. Bad Takes is produced by Grid, and it's specifically produced by Olivia Reingold. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who is out there listening. If you hear this show, if you like it, spread the word. Tell your friends. Tell your Twitter followers, your Facebook people. If you're Ken Salazar, please email us at badtakes@grid.news.
What's going on?
If you are not Ken Salazar, really just give us high ratings on the show, and we will be back with more Bad Takes.